Imagine a story so baffling that it makes you question everything you know about safety, family, and the world we live in. What if I told you that two young children vanished from their own home on a bright spring morning, and despite an enormous, meticulously coordinated search, not a single trace of them was ever found? No footprints, no clothing, no toys, no signs of struggle, nothing. This isn't just a case of kids getting lost in the woods. This is the eerie and chilling disappearance of 6-year-old Lily Sullivan and her 4-year-old brother Jack. Their case has confounded investigators, divided entire communities, and raised disturbing questions about the systems meant to protect our most vulnerable. If you're drawn to stories that challenge your perception of reality, prepare yourself for a case that will leave you questioning everything. On May 2025, the morning seemed like any other in the isolated village of Landown Station, Nova Scotia. The sun filtered through the trees surrounding a weathered white trailer on Gearlock Road, where 27-year-old Malaya Brooks Murray was just starting her day. She recalls hearing her children playing Lily with her lively spirit, and Jack, always full of energy. But by 10 a.m., everything had turned into a nightmare. At exactly 10 a.m., Malaya called 911. Her voice, surprisingly calm under the circumstances, reported that her two children had vanished. She said they were playing around 8 a.m., but by 8:20 a.m., the house had fallen eerily silent. Her children were gone. But here's the troubling part. Malaya waited an hour and a half before contacting authorities. How does a parent wait so long when their children are missing? Malaya and her partner, 33-year-old Daniel Martel, claimed to have searched the house and nearby woods. But neighbors later stated they saw no sign of a search during that critical dawn window. Their explanations were vague, inconsistent, and, at times, contradictory. The search for Lily and Jack began in earnest soon after, but the investigation quickly turned into something far more sinister. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police arrived swiftly, and within hours, a full-scale operation was underway. Over 160 trained professionals, search dogs, drones, and helicopters scoured the dense forest surrounding the home, but no sign of the children was ever found. Despite the massive effort, nothing pointed to where Lily and Jack could be. No traces, no disturbances in the underbrush. It was as though they had simply vanished into thin air. And then came the twist that made everything feel even more wrong. Daniel Martel, the children's stepfather, provided a detailed description of what Lily and Jack were wearing that morning. He described Lily's pink shirt and white strawberry backpack with striking accuracy, but there was one problem. He hadn't seen Jack at all that day. Daniel admitted he had never laid eyes on his younger stepson that morning, yet he was able to describe Jack's clothing down to the smallest detail. How could he know this unless he was lying? The search itself was like nothing the small town had ever seen. Searchers covered over 5 square kilometers of treacherous terrain, battling heavy rainfall, fallen trees, and thick underbrush. The area was rugged and unforgiving, but even with all this precision, the children's whereabouts remained a mystery. Veteran search leader Amy Hansen would later call it one of the most exhaustive efforts she'd ever led. Yet, despite the unparalleled scale and dedication of the operation, not a single clue surfaced. What could possibly explain the disappearance of 2 children, seemingly in broad daylight, without a trace? Who can be trusted in a case like this? This is the unsettling story of Lily and Jack, a case that leaves more questions than answers, and one that will haunt the minds of those who seek justice for the most vulnerable among us. If you're not already hooked, you might want to hit that subscribe button. This is just the beginning of a mystery that will keep you questioning everything you thought you knew about family, trust, and safety. Every inch of the vast forest was meticulously combed, every shadow, every hollow, and every fallen tree examined with obsessive precision. Thermal drones hovered above, their sensors scanning for the faintest heat signature that might lead to the missing children. But despite the most advanced technology available, the search came up empty. The forest revealed its secrets: wildlife, hidden burrows, but no sign of Lily and Jack. As hours stretched into days without any substantial findings, the mood among the searchers began to shift. The community rallied together with extraordinary urgency and compassion. Neighbors, many of whom barely knew the family, joined the ranks of volunteers, trekking the dense woods for hours, desperately hoping for a breakthrough. Local businesses provided supplies, and volunteers kept the search teams fed and motivated. But the longer the search dragged on without results, the more a sense of dread began to seep into the atmosphere. Among the volunteers, murmurs started circulating. A feeling of unease spread like wildfire. This wasn't just a missing persons case. Something about this felt fundamentally wrong. The timeline of events provided by the parents seemed increasingly impossible to reconcile. How had the children gone missing in broad daylight without a trace? No footprints, no signs of struggle, no screams, just unerring absence. Even the most experienced searchers, familiar with these woods, couldn't shake the growing suspicion that there was something more to the story than they had been led to believe. As the search expanded, the absence of evidence became even more unnerving. In most cases, even the most sophisticated searches uncover at least the faintest trace of piece of clothing. Caught on a branch, a footprint in the mud, anything. But Lily and Jack had seemingly vanished as if they'd never existed at all. It was as though the forest itself had swallowed them whole. And as the days passed with no new leads, the focus of the investigation began to shift. The eyes of investigators turned away from the forest and began to scrutinize those who had been closest to the children, Malaya and Daniel, the people who had been the last to see them alive. The stage was set for a case that would test the very boundaries of truth, trust, and the eerie silence that accompanies unanswerable questions. To understand what had really happened to Lily and Jack, investigators would need to trace back to the last moment anyone outside their home had seen them. That moment came on the afternoon of Tuesday, the 29th of April, 2025. For Brian Ward, a school bus driver with over a decade of experience navigating the rural roads of Nova Scotia, that day was etched in his memory. Lily and Jack had been regulars on his bus route. He knew them well, their personalities, distinct as day and night. Lily was the talkative, energetic one, always bouncing with excitement, while Jack was quieter, more introspective but no less lively in his own way. On that Tuesday, Brian dropped them off at the end of their long driveway. The driveway snaked on its way through dense woods before reaching the family's trailer, hidden from the main road by the towering trees. Brian watched them walk hand in hand down the shadowy path toward home, a scene so routine it barely registered at the time. It was 3:45 p.m., and from that moment on, Lily and Jack were seen by no one but their parents. That image of them disappearing into the woods was the last independent sighting of the children by anyone outside their household. 3 days passed before the alarm was raised. 3 days is an eternity when it comes to missing persons cases, and during that critical period, the window for finding them alive was rapidly closing. By the time the authorities were alerted, the 72-hour window, one of the most vital timeframes in a missing persons investigation, had already passed. And when the school, where the children were enrolled, had its professional development day the following Wednesday, there was no one at the school to notice their absence, no teachers to ask questions, no administrators to raise the alarm. By Thursday, May 1st, the cracks in the story began to widen. The timeline, the inconsistencies, the eerie silence, all of it pointed to something far more sinister. What happened to Lily and Jack? The investigation was about to uncover answers that would shake the very foundations of what we believe about family, trust, and the truth itself. Malaya Brooks Murray's explanation for keeping Lily and Jack home from school on April 30th, 2025 was simple. Lily had developed a cough. It seemed like a reasonable decision, the kind any caring parent would make, and at first glance, no one would question it. But as investigators dug deeper, they began to find cracks in the story. There were no doctor's visits, no prescription records, and no pharmacy purchases to back up the claim. The supposed illness, it turned out, had no independent confirmation. Now, imagine your own childhood, or if you're a parent, think about your own kids. How many people might see them in a day? Neighbors, mail carriers, teachers, friends, or even the local store clerk? Children leave traces wherever they go. But after Tuesday, the 29th of April, Lily and Jack Sullivan seemed to vanish from the world leaving no sign they had ever existed. The family's home on Gearlock Road was isolated. The nearest neighbors were hidden deep, in the forest, far beyond view or easy reach. There was no cell service, no internet, and no 4am. Visitors. What had once been a peaceful retreat from the world now served as a dark, silent stage where the children could disappear without anyone noticing. Daniel Martell, the children's stepfather, worked at a local lumber mill but only worked one day a week. How could a family of 5 survive on such a limited income? There were no clear answers, no confirmed government benefits, no financial transparency. The family's, quote, situation was as mysterious as their sudden disappearance. Beyond their physical isolation, Malaya had distanced herself from her indigenous community when she moved in with Daniel. She had left behind family connections and the safety net that might have provided support, oversight, and protection. And the property itself seemed to tell its own story, a modest trailer with children's drawings on the walls and toys scattered around the yard, but also showing signs of neglect. Rusting debris, cluttered conditions, and animals living in cramped spaces painted a picture of a family struggling to maintain their home. Just a few feet from the trailer lived Daniel's mother, but the proximity didn't mean much. Investigators found that there was little to no interaction between the two households. The grandmother, who could have provided another layer of protection for the children, was not actively involved in their daily lives. For Lily and Jack, the school bus ride was their connection to the outside world. Their bus driver, Brian Ward, was the last person outside their household to see them, and in the days that followed, he became their silent witness. He recalled how, on the 29th of April, he dropped the children off at the end of their long wooded driveway. He watched them walk hand in hand, disappearing into the shadows of the towering trees. That was the last time anyone outside their family would see Lily and Jack. What happened in the 200 meters between the road and their home remains a mystery. That ordinary Tuesday, the 29th of April, 2025, was the last day Lily and Jack were seen by anyone beyond their household. After that, they would vanish, not just from the world outside, but from the timeline itself. The gap between their last confirmed sighting and the moment they were reported missing was not just a matter of hours, it was days. And in those missing days, something occurred, something so chilling that not even one of the most extensive search operations in Canadian history would uncover a trace. Those 72 hours, from the 29th of April to May 2nd, became known as the Silent Days, a period where Lily and Jack existed only in the accounts of the people closest to them. Those accounts, however, would soon prove to be far more troubling than anyone had imagined. By Wednesday, the 30th of April, the children were no longer seen by anyone outside their home. The professional development day at school gave the perfect cover, no one to notice their absence. The silence that filled those 3 days would echo throughout the investigation, slowly unraveling a story that no one could have predicted. And as the timeline fractured further, investigators would discover that these were not just any 72 hours. They were the last 72 hours of Lily and Jack's lives, as far as anyone outside their family could confirm. The absence of Lily and Jack from school on Thursday, May 1st, 2025, might have seemed like an ordinary event at first. It was a scheduled professional development day at Salt Springs Elementary, so there were no teachers marking them absent, no administrators checking in, and no automated systems flagging their missing attendance. Yet, this was the beginning of an unsettling pattern of increasing isolation. While other children might have spent their day in community programs, visiting friends, or running errands with their parents, Lily and Jack were allegedly confined to their trailer. Malaya Brooks Murray would later claim that the children were kept home because Lily had developed a cough, a common reason for a child's absence from school. On the surface, it seemed like a reasonable explanation. Responsible parents keep sick children home to prevent illness from spreading. But as investigators dug deeper, this claim quickly unraveled. There was no evidence to support the idea that Lily had been ill. No pharmacy records showing purchases of cough medicine, children's acetaminophen, or other typical remedies. No visits to the doctor, no phone calls to health lines, no prescription medications. In an age where even minor illnesses tend to generate some sort of paper trail, Lily's supposed sickness left no record behind. More troubling, there was no one who could corroborate the story. No neighbors saw the children in the yard, no delivery drivers encountered them, and no family or friends stopped by. It was as if they had disappeared completely from the outside world, shielded by their isolation. The family's remote living situation, which might have once offered them privacy, now provided the perfect cover for something far darker. Daniel Martel's work schedule only deepened the mystery. He claimed to work just 1 day per week at a local lumber mill, but when exactly he worked during those critical days was never fully confirmed. Was he home, with the children, or was he at work? His accounts of his whereabouts were inconsistent, further complicating the timeline. There were also troubling questions about the family's finances. With Daniel working only 1 day a week and no other visible source of income, how were they managing their basic needs? Were they making trips to the grocery store, the gas station, or other businesses? But a thorough review of local businesses, security cameras, and receipts revealed something disturbing. No one had seen the family in days. There were no confirmed purchases, no digital traces, no sightings of the children anywhere in the community. In the age of smartphones and social media, it's hard to believe a family could exist completely off the grid. Yet the Sullivan family seemed to have no digital footprint during these silent days. No photos, no social media posts, no calls or messages. Investigators combed through the family's phones and electronic devices, hoping to find some sign of life during those missing 72 hours. But what they found, or rather, what they didn't find, was deeply troubling. The weather during this period had been typical for late spring in Nova Scotia, cool, with occasional rain showers. A perfect excuse to stay indoors, but not enough to explain the grating, complete absence of the family from daily life. While other families in the area were out and about running errands and going about their normal routines, the Sullivan family seemed to have vanished completely. Security camera footage from local stores, gas stations, and other businesses revealed nothing. No purchases, no interactions, no sign of life. The significance of these silent days cannot be overstated. In a missing persons case, every hour counts, but here, crucial hours were lost. With no leads, no sightings, and no evidence, the investigation faced a monumental challenge. The longer the gap between when the children were last seen and when they were reported missing, the harder it would be to uncover the truth. This delay potentially sabotaged the investigation, as critical evidence and the witness recollections faded with time. Perhaps the most disturbing revelation was the isolation of the Sullivan family. In a small, rural community, neighbors usually look out for one another. They notice when something seems off. But the Sullivan family had become so disconnected from the world that they could vanish without anyone noticing. This isolation wasn't a mere accident. It was the result of deliberate choices, actions, and circumstances that had cut the family off from any potential help or protection. The consequences of that isolation would prove devastating. Malaya's distance from her indigenous roots, the family's isolated home, Daniel's sparse work schedule, and their lack of connections within the community created a dangerous isolation that no one could have predicted. As investigators would later piece together, the days between the 29th of April and May 2nd weren't just marked by the absence of Lily and Jack from the outside world. They were defined by a total absence of any typical family activity, no errands, no visits from friends or relatives, no interaction with neighbors, no engagement with the world outside their trailer. The children, once full of life and present in the community, had vanished without a trace by Wednesday, the 30th of April. By Thursday, May 1st, the family had seemingly disappeared into their own isolated world, with no contact from the outside. But the question loomed, were they truly isolated, or had they already been lost? This became the central enigma of the investigation. Was the absence simply the result of sick children being kept home, or was something far darker at play? The evidence, or rather the chilling lack of it, began to paint a disturbing picture. The silent days weren't just an inconvenient gap in the timeline, they were a void that swallowed Lily and Jack so completely that the largest search operation in Canadian history could not find a single trace of them. Investigators were starting to realize that the silent days were just the beginning of a story that would test the very boundaries of family dynamics, truth, and reality. itself. The morning of May 2nd, 2025, arrived grim and overcast in Landown Station, Nova Scotia. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, typical of late spring in the Maritimes. Inside the white trailer on Gearlock Road, what would become the most critical morning in the Sullivan family's history was about to unfold. Malaya Brooks Murray claimed that she woke up around 8 a.m. to the sounds of her children playing in the next room. At first glance, this might seem like an innocent detail, a parent's familiar recollection of morning sounds. But as investigators would soon discover, it would become one of the most scrutinized parts of the entire investigation. What exactly did Malaya hear? Was it the sound of two children playing joyfully, or was it something else? Her account of that morning became more confusing with every retelling. She initially described hearing Lily and Jack's voices, their laughter, and the sound of movement. But each time she recounted the story, these details seemed to change, becoming more vague and contradictory. The trailer's layout was simple. The children's room was adjacent to the master bedroom, separated by only a thin wall, making it easy for sounds to travel between rooms. If the children were playing, talking, or moving around, it would be easily audible to anyone awake in the next room. But this is where the story began to unravel. Malaya claimed that sometime between 8 o'clock and 8:20 a.m., the sounds abruptly stopped. The shift from playful noise to sudden silence was so noticeable that it seemed impossible not to investigate. But according to Malaya, she didn't check on the children right away. When pressed about the delay, her responses were inconsistent and evasive. Sometimes she said she waited a few minutes. Other times she claimed it was much longer. Daniel Martel's version of the morning added yet another layer of contradiction. He said that Lily had been coming in and out of the bedroom earlier in the morning, a detail that seemed to confirm that the children were awake. But his description of Jack's actions was more ambiguous, relying solely on the sounds he thought he heard from another room. Even more troubling, Daniel provided a detailed account of what both children were wearing, but when pressed further, he admitted something shocking. He had never actually seen Jack that morning. Daniel described Jack's blue boots, his clothing, and his demeanor, yet he never actually laid eyes on him. He based his descriptions solely on sounds and assumptions. How could he be so specific about a child he had never seen? This inconsistency raised serious doubts about the credibility of the family's account. The timeline became even murkier when investigators questioned the delay in calling 911. If the children had gone silent around 8:20 a.m., why did it take until 10 a.m. to report them missing? An hour and 40 minutes of unexplained time in a case where every minute mattered. Malaya and Daniel claimed they searched the house and the surrounding woods before calling for help, checking every room, every closet, every possible hiding spot. But why had they waited so long? And why had no one heard anything, not even their frantic calls? For the children, this delay would come to symbolize the eerie gap in the case, one that could change everything. As the investigation into the disappearance of Lily and Jack unfolded, neighbors and investigators alike began to question the validity of the search efforts the couple claimed to have conducted. Despite the urgency of the situation, no neighbors reported hearing calls for the missing children during the crucial 90 minutes after their disappearance. There were no visible signs of frantic searching from the road or neighboring properties. Instead, what stood out was the couple's remarkably composed demeanor. Malaya's calm and controlled voice during the 911 call raised immediate concerns for emergency dispatchers. In a situation as dire as this, one would expect to hear frantic distress, but Malaya's voice was almost too steady, too matter-of-fact. This lack of emotional response, in the face of her children's disappearance, struck the dispatcher as unusual, especially when considering the gravity of the situation. While everyone reacts differently to trauma, the absence of visible panic or desperation was a red flag. When first responders arrived, they were met with an unexpected scene. Rather than parents desperately continuing their search, the officers encountered a couple who seemed oddly resigned to the situation. There were no signs of an active search, no ongoing efforts to locate the children, which was shocking for the first responders who expected to find parents combing the area for any trace of their missing kids. Daniel Martel's detailed descriptions of Lily's pink shirt and white strawberry backpack stood out as crucial clues for the search operation. Yet, when it came to Jack, whom Daniel claimed to have never seen that morning, his descriptions were equally specific. This glaring contradiction raised immediate doubts. How could Daniel provide such intricate details about a child he hadn't seen? This inconsistency would haunt the investigation, leading investigators to question the validity of the family story from the very beginning. The family's isolation was equally troubling. When children go missing, it's common for families to immediately reach out to relatives, neighbors, or friends. But there was none of that. Instead, the family's entire response seemed confined to official channels 911 and cooperation with responding officers. This lack of engagement with their community highlighted just how cut off the Sullivan family had become from the very people who might have been able to offer help or support in a crisis. Even the physical evidence from the morning was conspicuously absent. In cases of children wandering off, there are usually signs, doors left ajar, toys dropped in haste, footprints in the dirt, but nothing was found. The trailer showed no evidence of a hurried departure or that the children had left of their own accord. There were no signs of struggle or alarm, just an eerie emptiness. As the morning unfolded, it became clear that this was not just about two missing children. It was about unraveling the layers of a family's hidden dynamic secrets that had been buried behind the walls of an isolated household. The inconsistencies in the timeline, the contradictions in their behavior, and the lack of evidence pointed to something more sinister than a simple disappearance. By the time first responders began their search, they were already working with a foundation of uncertainty and doubt. The hours that should have been spent finding Lily and Jack were instead consumed by the search for the truth behind their disappearance. The investigation had already become a puzzle, and it was only just beginning. Within hours of the 911 call, the serene forest of Gearlock Road transformed into the scene of one of the largest and most comprehensive search operations in Nova Scotia's history. The response was swift, but as the hours dragged on with no sign of the children, the search expanded exponentially. By the end of the first day, more than 160 professionals from various agencies had been involved in the effort. Amy Hansen, the seasoned search and rescue leader, had coordinated countless operations, but even she could feel the weight of this one. She knew how critical the first 24 hours were in a missing persons case, especially when it involved children. The clock was ticking, but with every passing minute, the mystery surrounding Lily and Jack only deepened. What Amy Hansen didn't anticipate was facing a case that would test every assumption she had about how missing children typically behave in the wilderness. The search area was meticulously mapped using GPS, covering over 5 square kilometers of dense forest. The terrain, still scarred by the devastation of Hurricane Fiona from the previous year, presented significant challenges. Fallen trees littered the landscape, creating natural barriers and hiding places, while thick underbrush made visibility limited to only a few meters in any direction. The forest itself seemed to conspire against the searchers. Recent rainfall turned trails into muddy quagmires, and the heavy canopy blocked most of the sunlight, casting the woods into a constant shadow, even at midday. Despite these obstacles, the search teams were well-equipped and experienced. Thermal imaging drones soared overhead, scanning for heat signatures that could indicate human presence even through the thick forest cover. The drones swept the entire forest in precise, overlapping patterns, ensuring every inch of the area was covered multiple times. Helicopters hovered above, their crews armed with high-powered binoculars and specialized spotting scopes, scanning the forest floor from above. The sound of helicopter rotor blades became a constant presence, a harsh reminder of the urgency of the operation. On the ground, canine units with specially trained tracking dogs were deployed, hoping to pick up any trace of the children. The dogs were given clothing from the children's room to establish scent trails and released into the forest. But from the outset, the dog's behavior was perplexing. In most cases, tracking dogs follow a scent trail with unwavering focus. But here, the dogs seemed confused, disoriented. They circled around the immediate area, whining and losing interest, as if they were unable to find any scent at all. It was as if the children's trail simply didn't exist. The search grid was divided into sectors, with each team responsible for thoroughly combing their assigned area. Searchers moved systematically through the dense forest, calling out the children's names every few minutes, hoping for a response. The sound of voices calling Lily, Jack, echoed throughout the woods, a haunting chorus of hope and desperation that seemed to bounce off the trees, swallowed by the silence. Volunteers from the local community, many with children of their own, joined the official search. Though they weren't trained professionals, they brought local knowledge and an emotional drive to find the missing children. Their presence was invaluable, adding a layer of humanity to the high-tech operation. Local businesses rallied behind the effort, donating supplies and food, while residents opened their homes to provide shelter and support to the exhausted search teams. The community, which had once been isolated and remote, now became a network of individuals united by a single goal: to find the missing children. But as the first day wore on, the absence of any trace of the children began to take its toll on the searchers. In most missing persons cases, even under the most challenging conditions, there are always some signs of the person's passage footprints in the soft earth: a torn piece of clothing, caught on a branch, disturbed foliage where someone had passed. But in the search for Lily and Jack, nothing was found. The forest remained eerily untouched, no signs of their passage, no trails leading anywhere. It was as though the children had never entered the woods at all. On the second day, the search expanded to include nearby water sources. Specialized dive teams were called in to search ponds, creeks, and drainage areas where the children might have become trapped or fallen. The water searches were thorough, with divers examining every submerged log, every depression in the water. But again, nothing. No disturbed sediment, no clothing, no signs of recent activity. The water, like the forest, was untouched. It wasn't until the third day that the searchers made their only significant discovery. In a mossy section of the forest, about 300 meters from the Sullivan trailer, a single boot print was found. The print appeared small, possibly the size of a child's foot, and was preserved clearly in the damp moss. For a brief moment, hope surged through the search teams. Finally, there was something concrete to investigate. It seemed as though the children might have been in the forest after all. The area around the print was immediately cordoned off and subjected to an intensive forensic examination. Specialists photographed the print from multiple angles, measured it carefully, and compared it to known shoe sizes for the missing children. It seemed to match the size of Jack's feet, though a definitive match couldn't be made without the actual shoes. The discovery of the boot print created a spark of optimism, but that hope was short-lived. Despite searching the area around the print in all directions, no additional footprints were found. No trail leading away, no other signs of human passage. The isolated nature of the Proman, single boot print, with no other trace to follow, was almost more disconcerting than if nothing had been found at all. The searchers now faced the harsh reality that even the smallest clue might not be enough to unravel the mystery of what had happened to Lily and Jack Sullivan. How does a child leave behind a single, clear footprint in soft moss and then vanish without a trace? The print, so distinct and isolated, seemed to defy all logic. Investigators couldn't help but question its authenticity. Was it really related to the missing children, or had it been left by one of the searchers themselves? The area had been scoured by dozens of people, and, without any supporting evidence, the boot print became just another puzzle piece that didn't fit into the larger mystery. By the end of the first week, the search operation was significantly expanded, incorporating specialized units and resources that marked a shift in the Brothers and St. investigation's focus. In addition to the ground teams, aerial units, and water search squads, new technology was brought in. Ground-penetrating radar was deployed to explore areas around the family, property, and along potential travel routes. This high-tech equipment can detect any disturbance in the soil that might suggest buried objects or areas that have been recently disturbed. The surveys, however, yielded no results, no signs of digging, no fresh soil shifts. Meanwhile, specialized cadaver dogs, trained to sniff out the faintest trace of human remains, were brought in to assist the tracking dogs. These highly trained animals, capable of detecting decomposition that's imperceptible to the human nose, found nothing. No sense, no signs. The forest remained unyielding. The resources pouring into the search were staggering. Hundreds of people, multiple aircraft, high-tech equipment, and continuous support operations came at an immense cost. But the commitment to finding Lily and Jack never wavered. Local businesses continued their generous support, donating supplies and food, while the entire community rallied behind the search. Media attention swelled, and the story of the missing children spread across the region, capturing the public's attention and sympathy. But behind the scenes, the seasoned search professionals began to privately acknowledge something they couldn't yet say aloud. The absence of evidence, the lack of any real leads, and the inconsistencies in the family's accounts were beginning to paint a troubling picture. It was becoming increasingly clear that this wasn't a typical missing persons case. On May 7th, 5 days after the children were reported missing, the search operation was officially scaled back. Authorities, while careful with their wording, acknowledged the dwindling chances of finding Lily and Jack alive in the dense terrain. The shift from an all-out rescue mission to a more focused investigation was a difficult one, but necessary. The reduced search efforts were a devastating blow to the community, many of whom had invested so much emotionally in the hope of finding the children. Still, a few volunteers couldn't let go of the idea that their children might still be hidden somewhere in the woods, continuing their own searches, determined to find some trace, no matter how small. The aerial surveillance, drones, and small ground teams continued through May 18th, but the urgency had faded, replaced by a grim persistence. The helicopters still sliced through the sky, the drones continued their mechanical sweeps, and small teams trekked through the difficult terrain, but the hope that had fueled the search seemed to be dwindling. Then, on May 18th, all coordinated search operations were suspended. The sound of helicopter blades ceased, and the quiet that filled the air around Gearlock Road was palpable. It was a silence that replaced days of relentless activity, the absence of the search teams, the removal of command posts, and the cessation of the constant calling of the children's names left a void as deep as the absence of Lily and Jack themselves. The search, which had involved hundreds of dedicated professionals, consumed thousands of hours and covered every possible corner of the dense forest, had found nothing. No toys, no clothing, no footprints, no reliable scent trails. The forest had kept its secrets. It was as if Lily and Jack had never existed in that wilderness at all. But the lack of evidence, the complete absence, told investigators something else. It was no longer just about the search for two missing children. The absence of clues, the missing pieces, now shifted the investigation's focus away from the woods and toward the people who had last seen them alive. If you're still with us, make sure to subscribe, because this case is about to take twists that will challenge everything you think you know about missing person investigations. The truth, as it turned out, was hidden much closer than anyone could have imagined. As the massive search operation for Lily and Jack Sullivan came to an end, investigators shifted their focus to a far more unsettling realm: the family's private, insular world. What they uncovered was a household filled with contradictions, isolation, and circumstances that raised more questions than answers. The Sullivan family lived in a small white trailer at the end of Gearlock Road, a place surrounded by dense woods that provided both seclusion and total separation from the outside world. The nearest neighbors were hidden deep within the prominent forest, several hundred meters away, and there was no cell phone service, internet, or even a landline. Their home existed in an isolated bubble, almost cut off from any external influence or help. Inside the trailer lived 27-year-old Malaya Brooks Murray, her 33-year-old partner Daniel Martell, and their 3 children. Lily, 6, and Jack, 4, were Malaya's children from a previous relationship, while Meadow, just 16 months old, was the daughter of Malaya and Daniel. Life in the cramped trailer was a constant struggle for privacy and space. As the family of 5 lived in close quarters, surrounded by the chaos of personal belongings, multiple cats, and at least one dog. The space was cluttered and far from ideal, with animals and clutter adding to the chaotic atmosphere. But what raised the most immediate questions was the family's financial situation. Daniel claimed to work 1 day a week at a local lumber mill, but even he seemed unclear about how such limited income could support a family of 5. With no confirmed government, benefits, unemployment insurance, or other sources of documented income, the family's financial reality seemed almost impossible to reconcile. When questioned about their financial situation, Daniel's responses were vague and inconsistent. He explained that they made do with what they had, but offered no concrete details or proof. The absence of any financial records, such as receipts, bank statements, or even proof of everyday purchases, only deepened the mystery. But the family's isolation wasn't just physical. Malaya, a member of the Siksikatic First Nation, had severed ties with her extended family and cultural community by moving into the remote trailer with Daniel. Her decision to withdraw from the rich cultural network and support system of her indigenous heritage was concerning to those who knew her. It left her vulnerable and disconnected, with no safety net to support her children in times of crisis. Daniel, too, had grown up in Landown Station, the very same isolated place where the children would eventually be reported missing. His childhood home was the trailer where their family now lived, and just a few feet away, his mother resided in a second, nearby dwelling. But despite their physical proximity, there was virtually no interaction between the two households. The grandmother, who might have offered another layer of care and protection for the children, was largely absent from their lives. The property itself told a story of neglect. In addition to the 2 trailers, the yard was scattered with rusting debris, broken toys, and the remnants of a household that had long since abandoned any effort to maintain order or safety. The yard was cluttered with hazards, making it difficult for children to play safely. Neighbors and locals who were later interviewed by investigators painted a picture of a family that had gradually withdrawn from social life. There were no regular visitors, no participation in community events, and no interactions with other families. The only real connection the children had to the outside world was their school, Salt Springs Elementary. With fewer than 90 students, it was a small school, but one where Lily and Jack had begun to show signs of adjusting well. Teachers described them as quiet, but socially appropriate, contradicting the family's later claims of developmental issues. The contrast between the children's behavior at school and the descriptions provided by Malaya and Daniel raised questions about what was really happening inside their home. The family's routine seemed wholly consumed by their isolation. There were no regular trips to the grocery store, no visits to relatives, and no participation in any social activities. Their world appeared to be limited to the trailer and its immediate surroundings. Even their health care was alarmingly absent. There were no regular pediatric visits, no vaccination records, and no documented evidence of routine medical care. When Lily was allegedly sick, with a cough in the days before their disappearance, there were no doctor's visits, no medication, and no attempt to seek professional advice. The absence of basic childhood care and documentation stood out as a glaring red flag. In every corner of the Sullivan family's life, there was a pattern of isolation and secrecy and absence that, as the investigation unfolded, would raise deeper concerns about the safety and well-being of the children. Most families accumulate a trail of records marking their children's lives, school reports, medical visits, photos, receipts from outings and purchases. But Lily and Jack Sullivan seemed to exist in a vacuum, with shockingly little documentation of their everyday lives. The family's relationship with technology was equally unusual for the modern world. With no internet access and limited cell phone service, they were completely cut off from the digital age that most children take for granted. There were no social media posts featuring the children, no digital photos chronicling their growth, no online presence of any kind that would confirm their existence. This technological isolation meant that the children's lives were filtered entirely through the Gratum, adults who controlled their world. Their voices, their experiences, their thoughts, all were mediated by Malaya and Daniel. There was no independent record of their lives, no photos or stories from friends, no external viewpoints on their upbringing. Their existence was only defined by the accounts given by the parents, and as the investigation progressed, these accounts were becoming increasingly unreliable and suspicious. Lily and Jack's extended family situation was equally complex. Their biological father had little to no contact with them, and his family was even more disconnected. This lack of a broader support network, no grandparents, aunts, uncles, or cousins, meant that Lily and Jack had no alternative sources of care, oversight, or protection. The isolation the family experienced wasn't just geographical, it was social and familial as well. As investigators began digging into the family situation, it became clearer just how deeply Lily and Jack were cut off from the outside world. What might have once seemed like a secluded, private life had become something far darker. They were living in a bubble, entirely dependent on Malaya and Daniel for everything, from their care and protection to their connection with the outside world. Without any backup systems or independent advocates, the children were invisible to the world beyond their home. The investigation was beginning to reveal the full scope of their isolation. It was a situation where two young children could disappear without a trace, and no one beyond their, quote, immediate family would ever know. The picture of a family simply seeking privacy and independence began to collapse, revealing a far more troubling reality, a closed, isolated system in which children could vanish and the world would never know. As investigators continued to examine the details of the children's disappearance, a troubling pattern of contradictions began to emerge. What had started as a simple missing persons case was quickly evolving into something much more complicated. Each new detail raised more livid questions than it answered, and inconsistencies in the timeline of events were the first major red flag. At first, Malaya and Daniel's account of the morning of May 2nd seemed straightforward. The Windabai and Abai children were heard playing around 8 a.m. The house fell silent between 8 o'clock and 8:20 a.m., and the 911 call was made at 10 a.m. It appeared simple enough. But as investigators pressed for more details, the timeline became less clear. The exact time Malaya had woken up fluctuated, the duration of the children's play sounds changed, and the time between realizing the children were gone and calling 911 seemed to stretch longer with each retelling. Most troubling of all was the 90-minute gap between when they supposedly discovered the children were missing and when the call was made. Their claim that they had searched the house and woods during this period was unsupported by any evidence. Neighbors reported no sign of frantic searching, no cries calling out for missing children, and no activity that would suggest an urgent search for the kids. The couple's calm behavior was out of place in such a dire situation. Daniel Martel's responses during interviews became even more troubling as the investigation progressed. His decision to voluntarily take a polygraph test, though it seemed cooperative, raised questions about his true motivations. When asked why he wanted to clear his name, Daniel's response was telling. He said, "I just want to clear my name because I feel like the public is turning against me." His focus on clearing his name, rather than on finding his children, was unusual. Most parents in such a situation would be singularly focused on the search efforts, not on defending their own reputation. Then, during a media interview, Daniel made a statement that caught the attention of investigators. When asked about his hopes for the investigation, he replied, "I just hope they find something." The phrasing seemed innocent enough, but to those trained to read between the lines, it was subtly significant. Daniel's hope was not that his children would be found alive, but simply that something would turn up. It was a small slip, but one that revealed a mindset far removed from that of a desperate parent hoping for a miracle. This, along with everything else that had come to light, shifted the investigation's focus in a new direction. The questions were no longer just about finding Lily and Jack. They were about uncovering the truth behind the adults who claimed to have cared for them. Daniel's choice of words was striking. Instead of saying, "I hope they find them," or "I hope they find the children," he said, "I hope they find something." This subtle shift in language did not go unnoticed by investigators. In criminal investigations, even the smallest word choices can reveal a great deal about a person's true knowledge or state of mind. The use of something instead of them suggested that Daniel might already know that Lily and Jack were beyond finding. While this alone wasn't conclusive, it was certainly significant, especially as investigators began to scrutinize every aspect of the family's behavior. Malaya and Daniel's public appearances were equally unsettling. Both appeared unnaturally calm during interviews. They spoke in measured tones, showed no signs of emotional distress, and seemed disturbingly detached from the gravity of the situation. While everyone processes trauma differently, the absence of visible grief or panic was unusual for parents whose children were missing. Behavioral experts often note that genuine grief is hard to fake convincingly, and the couple's composed demeanor stood in sharp contrast to the emotional reactions typically seen from parents in such situations. What raised even more concern was the family's tendency to use past tense when referring to the children. Within days of reporting them missing, both Malaya and Daniel began speaking about Lily and Jack as though they were already gone. Daniel's comment about Lily's backpack being probably brown now from exposure to the outdoors stood out as particularly telling. This shift to past tense occurred remarkably quickly, even before the search efforts were scaled back. Typically, parents of missing children continue to speak in the placidas and great missing children, present tense, clinging to hope and refusing to accept that their children may not be found alive. The sudden shift suggested an awareness or acceptance of the children's fate, which contradicted the family's reported timeline. The investigation took a more intense turn when investigators seized the family's electronic devices. Cell phones, computers, and any other digital devices were confiscated and subjected to a thorough forensic analysis. The digital forensics team examined call records, text, messages, internet search histories, GPS data, and other digital traces that might offer insight into the family's movements and activities in the days leading up to the children's disappearance. While the specific findings were not made public at first, the decision to seize the devices signaled a shift in focus from searching for missing children to investigating potential criminal activity. Phone records became a focal point, as they could reveal who the family had been in contact with when calls were made and from what locations. GPS data could track the family's movements during the critical window when the children were last seen. If the phones had been used in places not mentioned in the family's account, it could provide crucial evidence of what had really transpired. Internet search histories were another area of intense scrutiny. Searches related to topics such as body disposal, missing person procedures, or legal advice could indicate knowledge or intentions that were troubling. While the specifics of the family's online searches weren't revealed, the seizure of their devices strongly suggested that investigators believed the family's digital activity might hold key clues. Compounding the investigation's challenges were several administrative blunders that further fueled public skepticism. On the 11th day of the investigation, the RCMP released a media bulletin aimed at reinvigorating public interest. However, the document contained a glaring mistake. Lily's name was misspelled throughout. This seemingly minor error became a focal point for critics, who saw it as a sign of the RCMP's lack of attention to detail in a case that required nothing less than precision. This blunder came at a time when public confidence in the investigation was already eroding. The mounting questions about the family's account, combined with the absence of solid leads in the case, created an atmosphere where any mistake by law enforcement was amplified. Public trust in the investigation was shaky at best, and the misspelling of Lily's name only worsened the situation. Despite the investigation's best efforts, no credible sightings of the children were reported after May 1st. Over 355 tips came in during the first 2 weeks, and more than 50 formal interviews were conducted, but not a single person could confirm having seen Lily or Jack alive after that date. This complete absence of independent verification during such a critical period became a cornerstone of the investigation's growing suspicions, casting a dark shadow over the family's account and the mystery of what had truly happened to the children. As the investigation into the disappearance of Lily and Jack Sullivan continued, the family's facade began to crack under the weight of growing scrutiny. The pressure of constant media attention, combined with the lack of progress in finding the children, began to affect Malaya and Daniel's relationship. Subtle signs of tension emerged during their joint media appearances, and sources close to the family reported increasing conflict between the couple. By the third week of May, the cracks in their united front were more visible, with Malaya beginning to distance herself from some of the statements made earlier on behalf of the family. This shift in her behavior set the stage for a dramatic development in the case. The contradictions and red flags that had emerged in the early days of the investigation were beginning to form a picture that was increasingly difficult to ignore. What initially seemed like a straightforward missing persons case was rapidly evolving into something far more disturbing. Investigators started to suspect that the truth behind Lily and Jack's disappearance was being obscured by a web of lies and misdirection, and they were closing in on the family as the source of those lies. As the investigation entered its third week, the case had captured the attention of the entire region. News outlets across Atlantic Canada were following the story closely, and the family found themselves in the midst of intense public scrutiny. It was during this period that Malaya and Daniel made a series of public statements that would go on to be some of the most analyzed and controversial aspects of the entire investigation. Their media appearances were carefully orchestrated by the RCMP's communications team, intended to generate renewed public interest in the case and perhaps lead to new tips. However, what they actually accomplished was something quite different. They provided a disturbing window into the family's mindset, raising more questions than they answered. In their first televised interview, broadcast on May 15th, Malaya and Daniel appeared composed and well-rehearsed. They sat side by side, their clothing neat, their demeanor calm and professional. The setting was formal, the lighting flattering, and their responses articulate. At first glance, they seemed like any parents of missing children, concerned, cooperative, and trying to do what they could to help the investigation. Malaya explained to the Pakshan Enzyme interviewer, "When we noticed the children were gone, we immediately jumped in the vehicle and surveyed the area. Many dirt roads, many culverts, as much as we could, and waited for the police to get there." But behavioral analysts who reviewed the interview noted several concerning elements. Their language was formal and practiced, as if the couple had rehearsed their responses. The emotional tone was flat, lacking the desperation and panic typically seen in parents of missing children. The absence of visible anguish was striking, and experts found it difficult to believe the couple's calm demeanor was genuine. Even more troubling was the couple's use of past tense when referring to the children. In particular, Daniel's comment about Lily's favorite backpack stood out. He described it as white with red strawberries before casually adding, "It's probably brown now from being out in the elements all this time." The nonchalance with which he discussed the deterioration of his stepdaughter's belongings suggested an acceptance of the children's fate, one that seemed far too early and too certain for a parent still hoping for a safe return. Most parents of missing children hold on to hope, refusing to entertain thoughts of their children being lost forever. But Daniel's comment indicated that, by this point, he may already have come to terms with the idea that Lily and Jack were gone. It was a shift in thinking that seemed out of step with the public search efforts and the family's supposed concern for the children's well-being. Throughout the interview, the couple's media strategy appeared more focused on managing their public image than on assisting the investigation. They talked about their willingness to cooperate with law enforcement, their readiness to take polygraph tests, and their frustration with public speculation about their involvement. Yet, they provided remarkably few details about the children themselves, no personal anecdotes, no specific memories that would help the public understand who Lily and Jack truly were. The lack of personal stories about the children raised a red flag for investigators. When asked about the children's daily routines, Malaya and Daniel provided vague, generic responses that could apply to any child. They spoke of the normal activities any child might engage in, but there were no specific details that painted a picture of Lily and Jack as individuals with unique personalities. This absence of depth in their answers suggested that they either didn't know or weren't willing to discuss the children's true lives. Their carefully crafted media appearances, coordinated with legal counsel, seemed more focused on deflecting suspicion than generating new leads. Yet it was the couple's body language that raised the most concern among experts in criminal psychology. Dr. Sarah Chin, a forensic psychologist specializing in criminal behavior, analyzed the couple's public appearances and noted a concerning lack of genuine emotional distress. The absence of authentic grief was striking and raised doubts about their true emotional state. As the investigation continued, it became increasingly clear that the family's behavior was inconsistent with what would be expected from parents whose children were missing. With each new statement and each new interview, The layers of their carefully constructed narrative began to peel away, revealing troubling signs that something far darker was at play. The investigation was no longer about finding two missing children. It had become a quest to uncover the truth hidden beneath the surface of the family's facade. Dr. Sarah Chin, a renowned forensic psychologist, remarked, "While people respond differently to trauma, the complete absence of anxiety, desperation, or grief is statistically rare among parents of missing children. The controlled demeanor and carefully rehearsed responses suggest a different set of priorities than typically seen in these cases." This observation about Malaya and Daniel's behavior was echoed by linguistic experts, who also analyzed the couple's choice of words. Their consistent use of past tense, formal descriptions, and a focus on procedural details over emotional appeals raised significant red flags. Professor Michael Davidson, a linguist specializing in criminal cases, reviewed transcripts of the couple's media interviews. He noted the language they used indicates emotional distance from the children. Descriptions of the kids felt more like memories rather than concerns for missing children who could still be found. This emotional detachment was not lost on the public, and social media platforms were quickly flooded with criticism. Many questioned the couple's sincerity, and the scrutiny grew as online communities began analyzing every detail of their media appearances. People dissected their body language, word choices, and facial expressions frame by frame, comparing their composed demeanor to the frantic, desperate pleas made by parents in similar situations. The emotional disconnect between Malaya, Daniel, and the community that had poured their hearts into the search was becoming painfully obvious. Volunteers who had spent days combing through thick forests, climbing over fallen trees, and searching through rugged terrain began to feel betrayed. Margaret Thompson, a local resident who had joined the raiders' search, expressed the growing disillusionment. "We gave everything we had to find those kids. We trudged through brush that tore our clothes. We climbed over fallen trees. To think we might have been looking for children who weren't even out there is heartbreaking." The contrast between the community's relentless efforts and the parents' distant presentations began to sour public opinion. While the couple occasionally acknowledged the search efforts in interviews, their responses seemed impersonal and rehearsed, lacking any emotional connection to the people who had given so much to help find their children. The emotional investment of the community highlighted the growing sense of betrayal, and residents started questioning whether their efforts had been in vain, spurred on by lies. Moreover, the couple's media appearances revealed contradictions in their statements, some of which hadn't been noticed earlier. Their accounts of the timeline, the children's activities, and their response to the disappearance began to shift in subtle but telling ways. One of the most troubling inconsistencies was Daniel's admission that he had never actually seen Jack the morning the children vanished, despite providing detailed descriptions of Jack's clothing and actions. This contradiction was seen as a significant red flag, suggesting that Daniel's knowledge of events was based on assumptions rather than direct observation, casting doubt on his credibility. As the investigation moved forward, it became increasingly puzzling that the couple continued to appear in the media despite mounting suspicion. Most parents in similar situations retreat into privacy, focusing on cooperating with law enforcement rather than managing their public image. The Sullivans, however, seemed more concerned with shaping the narrative through media appearances. Their decision to stay in the public eye, even as the investigation began to unravel their story, raised further doubts. Their final joint media appearance on May 22nd, 3 weeks after the children went missing, marked a shift in tone. What had once been a carefully orchestrated media strategy turned into an increasingly tense and uncomfortable interaction. Journalists began asking direct questions about the inconsistencies in their story, and the couple's responses grew more defensive. Signs of stress and irritation crept into their demeanor, and the mask they had carefully maintained started to crack. This would be their last public appearance together, as the investigation was about to take a dramatic turn. What was meant to be a strategy to garner sympathy had instead exposed a family whose actions were increasingly difficult to reconcile with the grief and concern typically displayed by parents of missing children. It became clear to investigators that the family had been speaking for the dead, not for the living. As the investigation entered its most intense phase, the truth about Lily and Jack Sullivan's disappearance began to emerge from the shadows. The mounting evidence pointed to a far darker reality than the one the family had portrayed. Public trust in the investigation had been shaken, but the time for media appearances and carefully crafted statements was over. The time for accountability was fast approaching. The absence of an Amber Alert in the case was another point of contention. This omission became a flashpoint for criticism, highlighting systemic issues in how missing children cases are handled, particularly in remote communities or when the children come from marginalized backgrounds. The public's frustration was palpable, and as the investigation unfolded, it became clear that the answers everyone was seeking were far more complex and unsettling than anyone had anticipated. The RCMP's decision to classify the case of Lily and Jack Sullivan as a vulnerable missing persons case rather than an abduction met the technical requirements of their standard protocols. However, it failed to address the urgency that the community felt was necessary. Under Nova Scotia's Amber Alert criteria, an alert is only issued if there is confirmation of an abduction, a detailed description of a suspect or vehicle, and a reasonable belief that the child is in imminent danger. In the case of the Sullivans, these conditions weren't fully met in the first critical hours. There was no confirmed abduction, no suspect vehicle, and no eyewitnesses to indicate the children had been taken against their will. According to the family's account, the children had simply wandered off on their own, which didn't meet the threshold for an Amber Alert. But many critics argued that this rigid interpretation of the criteria overlooked the unique and urgent circumstances of the case. Two young children, ages 4 and 6, had disappeared from a remote location surrounded by dangerous terrain. The immediate risk to their safety was severe, regardless of whether they had been abducted or simply gotten lost. Chief Michelle Glasgow of the Siksikatik First Nation was one of the first to publicly question the decision not to issue an Amber Alert. Speaking on May 7th, 5 days after the children were reported missing, she pointed out that the case went beyond the technicalities of the alert system. These children belong to our community, she said. They are Mi'kmaq children, and they deserve the same level of urgent response that would be given to any other missing children. The delay in issuing an alert may have cost precious time that could have saved their lives. Chief Glasgow's statement underscored a troubling trend in how missing persons cases involving Indigenous children are handled. Statistical analysis shows that Amber Alerts are less likely to be issued for Indigenous children, particularly those from remote or rural communities. These disparities are due to a range of complex factors, including limited communication infrastructure, unstable housing situations, and complications in identifying whether an abduction has occurred. However, critics argue that these operational challenges reflect deeper systemic discrimination rather than legitimate barriers. The failure to issue an Amber Alert in the Sullivan case was widely seen as part of a larger pattern of undervaluing the safety and lives of Indigenous children. Malaya's decision to move away from the Siksikatik First Nation and settle with Daniel in a remote location had severed many of the traditional support networks that might have prompted an earlier intervention. In Indigenous communities, extended family networks and community elders play an essential role in child protection, providing informal monitoring and early support. Without these safeguards, children become more vulnerable to harm. The geographic isolation of the Sullivan family home on Gearlock Road also played a critical role in the delayed response. The nearest neighbor was over a kilometer away, and the property was obscured from view by the thick forest. This isolation meant that the children's disappearance could go unnoticed for hours or even days before anyone outside the family became aware. Additionally, the surrounding terrain-dense forest, swampy areas, and rugged paths posed significant challenges for search and rescue operations. The region's inaccessibility, compounded by the aftermath of Hurricane Fiona, meant that specialized search equipment and trained personnel took longer to mobilize. Weather conditions also played a part in limiting the search efforts, as the risk of further severe weather hindered the safety and duration of search operations. Despite these challenges, critics argued that they should have prompted a more urgent and aggressive response, rather than a cautious one. The case highlighted the need for emergency response protocols to be more flexible, especially when dealing with vulnerable children in difficult and unique circumstances. The rigid application of Amber Alert criteria, designed primarily for urban abduction scenarios, proved inadequate in the case of young Indigenous children living in a remote rural setting. The failure to issue an Amber Alert became a rallying cry for advocates calling for reform in missing persons protocols. They argued that the system needed to be restructured to better serve all children, regardless of race, geography, or family situation. The controversy also raised critical questions about the resources allocated to missing persons investigations in remote, underserved areas, where response times and the ability to mount an effective search can be severely limited. The lack of specialized equipment, trained personnel, and adequate communication infrastructure in the rural areas where many Indigenous families live proved to be a persistent obstacle as the investigation into the disappearance of Lily and Jack Sullivan moved into its second week. These systemic challenges continued to fuel criticism from the community, with many questioning whether everything possible was being done to locate the missing children. By May 9th, 1 week after the children had first been reported missing, the RCMP's major crime unit officially took over the investigation. This marked a significant escalation, signaling a shift from a routine missing persons case to something far more serious. Although officials refrained from publicly stating their suspicions, the involvement of the major crime unit was a clear indication that investigators were no longer hopeful about finding the children alive. The major crime unit, typically tasked with handling homicides, serious assaults, and other major criminal investigations, brought additional resources and expertise to the case, suggesting that the search was now focused on uncovering a darker truth. Detective Inspector Sarah Morrison, a seasoned investigator with over 15 years of experience in major crime cases, was appointed lead investigator. Her first priority was to conduct a thorough review of the investigation's first week, looking for overlooked clues or evidence. What she uncovered was both impressive and frustrating. The search effort had been vast and comprehensive, involving over 160 trained professionals, multiple aircraft, specialized search dogs, and state-of-the-art equipment. Every accessible area within a 5 kilometers radius of the Sullivan property had been combed multiple times. Over 355 tips from the public were investigated. But despite the extensive resources dedicated to the search, no significant evidence had been uncovered. The lone boot print found near the property remained the only physical trace that the children had ever been there, but its value was questionable given the significant time lapse before it was discovered. The absence of more tangible evidence was unprecedented in Detective Inspector Morrison's career. In previous cases, even when children had wandered off into the base's wilderness, there were typically signs, torn clothing caught on branches, footprints in the branches, soil, or scent trails for dogs to follow. But in the Sullivan case, the complete absence of any such signs was deeply puzzling and unlike anything Morrison had encountered. The investigation team turned their attention to the timeline of events, conducting a minute-by-minute review of the family's actions in the days leading up to the disappearance. They cross-referenced Daniel and Malaya's statements with any available corroborating evidence. What emerged was a timeline full of gaps and inconsistencies. The family's accounts of the children's activities on the 30th of April and May 1st couldn't be independently verified. No, witnesses confirmed that the children had been sick and kept home from school, and there were no medical records to support the claim. Further discrepancies emerged in Daniel and Malaya's own accounts. Daniel stated that he had worked on May 1st, but his employer had no record of him being at the job site that day. Malaya's story was vague and inconsistent, changing slightly with each new interview. These inconsistencies raised further doubts about the family's narrative. The investigation team conducted interviews with over 50 individuals connected to the case, including family members, neighbors, school staff, and anyone who had seen the children in the days before they disappeared. Each interview was recorded and transcribed with careful analysis of any contradictions or new information. The interviews revealed a troubling pattern of isolation surrounding the Sullivan family. Many people described the family as reclusive, difficult to engage with, and withdrawn from the community. Teachers at the children's school noted that Lily and Jack were frequently absent, and when they did attend, they often seemed tired and hungry. Neighbors also reported that the children rarely played outside or interacted with other kids. The family did not participate in community events or maintain close relationships with others in the neighborhood. This isolation made it difficult for investigators to piece together the children's normal routines and behaviors, further complicating the investigation. As part of their efforts, the investigation team also conducted a comprehensive digital forensics examination of the family's electronic devices, including cell phones, computers, and tablets. The examination focused on communications, internet searches, location data, and any other digital traces that might provide new insights. The digital forensics team uncovered some intriguing patterns, which would become crucial as the investigation moved forward. These findings suggested that there was more to the case than initially met the eye, and the digital evidence began to piece together a darker story. The investigation into the disappearance of Lily and Jack Sullivan began to reveal unsettling patterns when investigators delved deeper into the family's digital and financial records. Daniel's phone activity in the days leading up to the children's disappearance showed very limited engagement, with only a few internet searches related to wilderness survival and search and rescue procedures. These searches were dated after the children went missing, which could be interpreted as a reflection of Daniel's stated concern over their disappearance, but it raised questions about the timing of his interest in such topics. Malaya's phone activity was more frequent, but much of it consisted of routine social media, interactions, and communications with family members. However, investigators found that significant amounts of data had been deleted from her phone in the days following the disappearance. When questioned about this, Malaya claimed it was simply routine cleaning of old photos and messages. But the timing of the deletions, coupled with the circumstances, raised suspicions among the investigation team. The financial records of the family painted a grim picture. The bank statements revealed that Daniel and Malaya were struggling financially, with overdue bills and minimal savings. Daniel's employment was sporadic, and the family depended heavily on government assistance to meet their basic needs. While financial stress doesn't explain the disappearance of children, investigators knew that economic pressures could contribute to family dysfunction and, in some cases, lead to desperate actions. The financial troubles became another troubling aspect of the case, adding to the growing complexity of the family's situation. As the investigation advanced, the strain within the Sullivan family became more apparent. Daniel and Malaya's relationship, which had once seemed supportive, began to show signs of serious tension. They were spending less time together, and during police interviews and public appearances, they began to avoid eye contact and each other's company. The intense pressure from law enforcement, media, and public scrutiny was clearly taking a toll on the couple. The public reaction to the case had intensified, with many in the community expressing their growing suspicions about the parents' involvement in the children's disappearance. Social media was flooded with critiques, and threats and harassment aimed at the couple became rampant. In interviews with investigators, Daniel began making subtle comments about Malaya's mental state. He described her as not herself and claimed that the stress had affected her ability to think clearly. She's saying things, thinking things that don't make sense, Daniel told investigators, casting doubt on Malaya's credibility. This marked a dramatic shift in Daniel's approach to the investigation. Previously protective of Malaya, he now seemed to position himself as the more reliable and trustworthy parent, subtly undermining her in the process. Malaya's sudden decision to leave the family property on Gearlock Road on May 18th shocked investigators and signaled a new development in the case. She moved in with her sister in Truro, citing the need for space and time to process the events. Malaya's departure was unexpected, and even Detective Inspector Morrison was caught by surprise. In a hastily arranged interview, Malaya explained, "I can't stay there anymore. Every room, every corner of that place reminds me of them. I keep hearing their voices, their laughter. I keep expecting them to come running through the door." But those working on the case suspected that there was more to her departure than simply the pain of grief. While Malaya's exit allowed investigators to interview her separately from Daniel, these interviews painted a more complex picture of the family dynamics. Malaya revealed that she had felt increasingly isolated and controlled by Daniel. She spoke about his anger and his tendency to blame her for their relationship problems. She also disclosed that their financial situation was even worse than they had previously admitted. Daniel, under pressure to find stable employment, had become angry and resentful, often blaming her for everything: his struggles at work, the children's behavior, and their financial instability. "Nothing I did was right," Malaya told investigators. "He blamed me for everything: the kids being difficult, for our money problems, for his trouble finding work. He said I was holding him back, that his life would be better without us." These revelations added a troubling layer to the investigation, suggesting that the children's disappearance might be rooted in deeper, familial issues that had been hidden behind the public facade of a grieving family. The cracks in the Sullivan family story were widening, and the investigation was starting to take a darker turn as the truth about what happened to Lily and Jack Sullivan began to come into sharper focus. As the investigation into Lily and Jack Sullivan's disappearance entered its third and fourth weeks, a troubling pattern began to emerge, particularly in the behavior of the parents. Daniel's social media accounts, which had previously been filled with urgent pleas for information about his missing children, began to shift focus. His posts became increasingly defensive, emphasizing his frustration with the public's growing suspicions and accusations. "People are judging me without knowing the facts," he wrote on Facebook. "They're making assumptions about me and my family based on rumors and lies. I loved my kids more than anything, and I would never do anything to hurt them. The truth will come out eventually, and when it does, all these people spreading lies will have to answer for what they've done." Malaya's social media activity, however, took a different direction. Her posts became filled with emotional messages about guilt, forgiveness, and the burden of keeping secrets. She shared cryptic quotes about the weight of truth, including one on May 22nd that read, "The truth has a way of coming out, no matter how hard you try to hide it. Sometimes the hardest thing is living with what you know, especially when speaking up might destroy everything you have left." The post was quickly deleted, but not before it was screenshotted and circulated widely. Many interpreted it as a subtle confession, or, at the very least, an admission that the full story had yet to be told. The contrast in their social media activity reflected the growing emotional divide between Daniel and Malaya. As the investigation continued, one of the most perplexing aspects remained the complete absence of physical evidence. Despite exhaustive searches involving highly trained professionals and advanced technology, there were no traces, no clothing, no footprints, no scent trails. In Dr. Rebecca Chin's professional opinion, this was highly unusual. "In my experience, it's virtually impossible for two children to disappear without leaving some trace," she told investigators. "Even in cases where bodies had been concealed, there were usually some clues: disturbed soil, altered vegetation, or scent patterns that trained search dogs could detect. But in this case, nothing had been found, which led investigators to consider the possibility that the children might not have been in the area at all, or that their disappearance had been meticulously planned." The shift in focus turned to the family, especially Daniel, who was familiar with the property and surrounding areas. This change brought mixed reactions from the community. Some residents expressed relief, believing the investigation was now zeroing in on the most likely explanation for the children's disappearance. Others, however, feared that focusing too heavily on the family might obscure other potential leads. "We all want answers," said Margaret Thompson, a neighbor who had participated in the initial search. "But we also want to make sure that the investigation is thorough and fair. These children deserve justice, but so does anyone who might be falsely accused of harming them." Tensions within the community mounted as the investigation reached its critical fourth week. The initial support for the family had slowly morphed into suspicion. Some residents still believed in the family's innocence, but a growing number were now convinced that the answers lay closer to home than anyone had originally imagined. The silence surrounding the Pax children's disappearance was beginning to speak volumes, suggesting that the truth might be far darker than anyone had hoped. As the summer approached, nearly 2 months had passed since Lily and Jack Sullivan vanished, and the case had shifted from a simple missing persons investigation to something far more complex and disturbing. Despite the exhaustive resources poured into the investigation, hundreds of interviews, thousands of tips, and the use of cutting-edge technology, no concrete answers had emerged. The financial cost was astronomical, and the emotional toll on the community and the family was immeasurable. With each passing day, the investigation seemed to be moving further away from finding the children and closer to uncovering the painful truth hidden beneath the family's carefully constructed facade. Despite the massive resources and exhaustive efforts dedicated to the search for Lily and Jack Sullivan, the case remained as shrouded in mystery as it had been on the morning of May 2nd, when Daniel first called 911. The investigation had uncovered troubling details about the place 40i, family circumstances, the timeline of events, and the behavior of the parents, but it had failed to yield the definitive evidence needed to bring charges or provide closure to the community. Detective Inspector Sarah Morrison, who had spent decades solving complex criminal cases, was particularly frustrated by the lack of resolution. "In my experience, even the most carefully planned crimes leave traces," she explained. "The complete absence of physical evidence in this case is unprecedented. It suggests either extraordinary luck or extraordinary planning." The investigation team had explored every possible theory about what might have happened to the children. They considered the possibility that the children had wandered off and died from exposure, been abducted by strangers, taken by someone known to the family, or harmed by family members. Every theory was thoroughly investigated, but none produced conclusive evidence. The initial theory that the children had simply wandered off into the wilderness had been the first to be tested. The massive search effort, which included highly trained search dogs and specialized teams, had combed every accessible area within a wide radius of the Sullivan property. Yet, no trace of the children was found. The possibility of a stranger abduction had also been explored. Investigators had looked into known sex offenders in the area, analyzed traffic patterns, and followed up on numerous reported sightings of the children. Again, none of these leads had provided credible evidence of an abduction. The theory that someone known to the family had taken the children was complicated by the family's isolation. The Sullivans had few close friends, and those who did know them were thoroughly investigated and cleared of suspicion. The children's biological father, though, contacted and questioned, provided a solid alibi for his whereabouts during the critical time. With no clear leads pointing to anyone outside the family, the investigation began to focus more heavily on the possibility that the children had been harmed by someone within their own home. The investigation had uncovered several red flags pointing to potential foul play, but it lacked the hard evidence needed to make an arrest. The timeline discrepancies in Daniel and Malaya's accounts remained unexplained. The parents' behavior, from inconsistent statements to their deteriorating relationship, raised further doubts. The couple had started to contradict each other in subtle but significant ways, and their strained relationship only added fuel to the growing suspicions. Financial pressures facing the family had been documented, and the dysfunction in Daniel and Malaya's relationship had been laid bare. Malaya's departure from the family home and the subsequent bitter exchanges between the parents indicated a significant breakdown in their relationship. Yet, despite the mounting circumstantial evidence and the emotional turmoil within the family, the Crown Attorney's Office concluded that there was insufficient evidence to support charges. The case remained open, but it had effectively stalled, frustrating both law enforcement and the community. The impact on the community had been profound. Initially, there was widespread support for the family, but as the investigation progressed, suspicion and division took hold. Some residents still believed in the family's innocence, feeling that the investigation had unfairly focused on them. Others were convinced that the answers lay within the family, frustrated by the lack of concrete evidence. The case also highlighted larger systemic issues in how missing children cases are handled, particularly those involving marginalized communities. The delay in issuing an Amber Alert had sparked widespread criticism, leading to calls for reform and emergency response protocols. The investigation also revealed cracks in the social safety net that may have prevented the tragedy if proper support systems had been in place. For Malaya's extended family, the ordeal had been devastating. Questions lingered about whether they could have done more, whether they could have intervened sooner or been more involved in the children's lives. "We keep asking ourselves if we could have done something different," said Malaya's sister Patricia. Maybe if we had been more involved, maybe if we had asked more questions, maybe if we had pushed harder when we had concerns. But you can't force someone to accept help, and you can't force someone to tell you the truth. The investigation also took a toll on the officers involved. Detective Inspector Morrison, who had worked on many difficult cases, admitted that the Sullivan case had been particularly challenging. The hardest part is not knowing, she said. In most cases, even when we can't prove what happened, we have a pretty good idea of the truth. In this case, we have theories and suspicions, but we don't have answers. The case had consumed vast resources, but as summer approached, the investigation seemed no closer to solving the mystery of what had happened to Lily and Jack Sullivan. The lack of resolution was not only frustrating for investigators but also heartbreaking for a community desperate for answers.